Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 11th of February 2025. This is a military aid video, quite a bit to get through and a few comments at the end I want to just discuss. Trump administration plans to push European allies to buy more American weapons for Ukraine ahead of potential peace talks with Moscow, according to Reuters. The plan, if formalized, will offer some reassurance to Ukrainian leaders who are worried that Trump might block further aid to the country. Okay, let's unpick what's going on with the US at the moment. The Trump administration appears to be, and I'm trying not to be too critical of the administration. I will try and tell you what they're doing and why they're doing it. So it appears to me that Donald Trump is very transactional, and therefore the people around him are going to follow along with that approach, which means that if the US is going to support Ukraine, it will not be for long-term strategic goals. So it's not a case of providing tens of billions of dollars of aid, military and financial aid to Ukraine because it fits in with the US's larger global aims and objectives. That actually it's good and right that Ukraine prevails, because actually security in the region will lead to a secure Europe, will mean that the US will be able to project its power closer to the Russian borders, and all these kind of things that are a lot more long-term in your thinking. With the Trump administration, with Trump at the helm, it's going to be, right, if we give aid to Ukraine, we want payment back for that. We want natural resources, rare earth minerals. And now we're hearing Trump on Fox News say that literally that. He says, we want repayment for what we have put in. We want $500 billion worth of rare earth, as he says, rare earth minerals, rare earth metals, etc., etc. So we are now moving to a very new era here in American support for Ukraine. That support comes with really, really big strings attached, and those strings are very short. They're not long-term strings. They're very short strings where we give you this, you give us something right away. We want money. We want payment for this. And that's not me kind of being critical. That's literally what Trump has said himself. Alongside that, though, there are lots of other things taking place. So here we've got Representative Joe Wilson, saying, today I'm introducing the Freedom First Lend-Lease Act to grant Trump the flexibility to send victory weapons to our partners, including Ukraine, to deter war criminal Putin, as Biden should have done long ago. Bring Russia to the table through American strength. So when the US first started supporting Ukraine, there was Lend-Lease in place, but it wasn't pulled on. It was it was there as a last straw type token. Then with successive appropriations bills, it got written out, and I think it might have even been written out by Democrats, although it might have been in response to perceived demands of the Republicans. So I'm not quite sure there. But anyway, Lend-Lease got written out, and it expired in September 2023, was it? And this was a real issue because, it meant that the US had fewer options. Well, now they want to try and rewrite it back in. This is the Kyiv Independent reporting on this. US Republican Congressman Joe Wilson announced a plan to reintroduce the Freedom First Lend-Lease Act to Congress on February the 10th. Reauthorizing this program would grant US President Donald Trump the authority to send Ukraine weapons through Lend-Lease. Wilson argued that this initiative would help deter war criminal Vladimir Putin, and he claimed that the former US President Joe Biden should have taken similar action earlier. I agree. However, I will also say that Trump is very, very, very unlikely to do this. Even if they pass this and there's a Lend-Lease in place, I don't think Trump will provide stuff to Ukraine without those strings attached to it. It's just that simple. Bring Russia to the table through American strength, Wilson wrote on X. Currently, details about the bill remain unclear, including whether it has support from other members of Congress. The $895 billion US defense bill passed by Congress in December 2024 did not include a provision to extend the Lend-Lease Act for Ukraine. That's it. It's on the National Authorization Act, Defense NDAA, isn't it? National Defense Authorization Act. Anyway, the budget for defense. That's what it got written out of, I think. Anyway, the US passed the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act in May 2022, but expired in September 2023. So yeah, that's right. Without ever being used. Ukrainian diplomats have been lobbying for its reintroduction as it allows the US president to loan or lease arms to Ukraine while cutting through congressional red tape. This would, of course, be really, really good if the US president would pull on a Lend-Lease provision. I just don't think it's at all likely that Trump's going to do that, unfortunately. So I think we're back to Ukraine's best hope of getting US support is through kind of prostituting their natural resources out, unfortunately. I was talking about this idea that the US wants Europe to step up, to pay more, to pay its fair share, etc., even though Europe is already doing that. And that is disinformation or misinformation from the White House, from Trump. He wants Europe to own the war, and yet he wants America to get the payment and not Europe to get the payment in natural resources. So I wonder whether Europe is going to have something to say about that. I also talked about, well, if you want to recede from the world, if you want Europe to take control of all its own security, then you need to get all of your bases out of Europe. There are no European bases in the US, but there are American bases in Europe type thing. So, clear off and take that all away. Of course, the problem with that, the problem with relying entirely on Europe to supply aid and support Ukraine is in terms of things like intelligence, surveillance, satellites, spy planes. There's an awful lot that the US do that Europe would struggle to pick up the slack on. If the US suddenly stopped supporting Ukraine and demanded that Europe did everything, and if there's a big division between Europe and the US, and Europe did, I mean, this would never happen, but said, sod off, okay, we'll do this all ourselves, you can take all your toys and go home. There's an awful lot of stuff that the US does that I don't think Europe would easily be able to replicate, particularly in kind of satellite. And I mean, we do have our capabilities, but I just think they're far more widespread from the Americans, and spy planes and all sorts. So I think we'd struggle a little bit there. Now, the European Union's lending arm, the European Investment Bank (EIB), has signed agreements to mobilise close to €1 billion, $1.03 billion in investments into Ukraine's public and private sectors as the US moves to cut funding to development projects in the country. So we're hearing that US aid is being cut, etc. And the assistance that the US will give to Ukraine will, as mentioned, come with strings attached. And I think, it's now up to Europe to do an awful lot of what the Americans were doing. Latvia has ordered the Patria 6x6 armoured personnel carriers to be delivered to Ukraine this year. The country's Ministry of Defence has said the number of vehicles has not been specified, but interesting that Latvia are providing some, what I presume selling some new APCs to Ukraine. Good news there. Lithuania to allocate $32 million for education of Ukrainian refugees. Lithuania will allocate nearly $32.9 million in 2025 to support the education of Ukrainians who have been relocated to the country due to the war, according to the Lithuanian broadcaster. Rheinmetall, the German concern, has delivered 5 more Caracal airborne tactical vehicles. So these are vehicles that can be dropped by helicopter to Ukraine. In total, Ukraine has now received 20 Caracal air mobile tactical vehicles, and that is what they look like there, kitted out. Good news there. Right, the first rocket flamethrower system, a smaller counterpart to the Russian TOS Solntsepyok and TOS Buratino. So these are the sometimes called flamethrowers, as he says here, first Ukrainian flamethrower. They are thermobaric rocket launchers is more accurate description, has been created. So the Ukrainian Armed Forces Lieutenant Colonel Mizura has said. So the Ukraine is now producing weapons that Russians were previously had in their repertoire. This looks like a far smaller, if this is indeed the thing, it's a far smaller version of what the Russians have. I think if I read somewhere else, yeah, I'm sure I read it's got a range of 10 kilometers, which is fairly, in fact, possibly a little bit more than the Russian. So the Russian thermobaric launcher only has, I think, a 6-kilometer range. Is why they end up getting caught quite often. They have to go very close to the contact line in order to be used. So a number of those TOS 1A launchers have been taken out because of the risky use of them. Okay, this was sent to me by Dimko, who I interviewed the other day from Jigaspur, and he is also in the unmanned systems forces. This is a post from Serhiy Stonenko, who does a lot of fundraising for drones and whatnot. He said emergency collection for EBM resistant drones. So we were kind of talking about this. Together, we found a batch of top-of-the-line 10-inch FPVs that are capable of bypassing enemy electronic warfare. They're equipped with an automatic frequency switching module. This is what we were talking about. That one way to get out of being interfered with electronic warfare is to be able to switch frequencies as you're flying. So rather than being set on this frequency, you fly up there and then there's a jamming on that frequency and your drone can't communicate to the operator and falls to the ground. If it can switch frequencies as it's flying, then obviously you have an advantage there. So they're equipped with an automatic frequency switching module, which significantly increases the chances of successfully hitting the target. They have already been combat applications, and the drones have performed excellently. We are going to purchase 1,000 of these FPVs, primarily for the Pokrovsk and Kursk directions. There are already requests. The amount of the collection will be 17 million hryvnias. So we need to pack for yesterday. So fundraising there for frequency switching drones. So these are definitely a thing, and indeed they are trying to get more of them. Right, interesting bit of footage of an F-16 that is flying very low here in Ukraine. So a low pass performed by a Ukrainian F-16, and what's significant about this is you can then do a screen grab and check what it's loaded with or what it's not anymore carrying. So the aircraft carries a full set of air-to-air missiles. So that's interesting. They are prepared to go into combat with Russian planes. So they're AIM-120 and AIM-9s. The aircraft also have 2 additional 370-gallon, 1,400-litre fuel tanks. So the F-16 don't have that much range, I think. So they're extending the range with fuel tanks. The ALQ-131 electronic countermeasure system is installed on the central point of the suspension. In other words, it looks like this plane is being used as a fighter against other planes, which I find quite fascinating, rather than using being loaded, having a loadout of guided glide bombs or harm missiles or whatever. So interesting. Thomas Tyner talks about Gripen E plane and actually criticizes it quite a bit, or criticizes people who think this is the answer. And I've been talking about how the Gripen should be one of the main planes that the Ukrainians use because of short runway, doesn't pick up FOD, foreign object debris, because of the air intakes being in a different place to the F-16, etc., etc. He says, of course, Gripen has a fast turnaround time due to having the fewest hard points of all Western fighters and the smallest fuel tank of all Western fighters. The Gripen also has the shortest combat range of at full weapons load. If you want to extend the range, either you can't use the full weapons load, or you have to mount external fuel tanks, which of course use weapon hard points. The Gripen E also has less thrust than all other Western fighters, and it doesn't supercruise. That's a load of bollocks. In 2009, Saab's Gripen NG demonstrator without weapons or weapon pylons climbed to 28,000 feet and then used the afterburner to accelerate to Mach 1.2 and then cut the afterburner, and then the plane continued at Mach 1.2 for a bit. That's not super cruise. Saab likes to tout an anecdote by one person from the 2006 Red Flag Alaska, where supposedly the just introduced Gripen A excelled at beating 25-year-old Norwegian F-16A Block 15 MLU midlife upgrade. But Saab is eerily silent about the Gripen's performance since then. And the claim that the F-35 isn't suited for Arctic combat, while the Gripen is uniquely suited for it, is bollocks too. These are F-35A at Thule AFB in Greenland in January 2023, the northernmost and coldest airbase in the world. Also, Rovaniemi AFB in Finland and Eilson AFB in Alaska are both colder than Sweden's northernmost Gripen airbase at Luleå. The Gripen makes sense if you only want to defend your territory, and your territory is smallish, i.e. Ireland, but of the three European nations which have not yet chosen a new fighter, only Hungary and Ireland might opt for the Gripen E. Portugal can't, as its air defence identification zone includes the Azores and Madeira, and the Gripen E just doesn't have the range. In short, the Gripen E is the tiniest of the Western fighters, and no matter how much humbug Saab and its fanboys throw out there, it just can't compete when it's up against the F-35A, F-35B, Eurofighter, Rafale, F-15EX or F-16V Block 7072. And for the last time, the Gripen E engine is manufactured in the US, and you can't just plug in a Eurofighter EJ200 or Rafale M88-4E engine willy-nilly. So ordering Gripen E to spite Trump, as some suggested Canada should do, would get you a fighter fuselage sans engine. In short, you may love the Gripen as much as you want. Air forces who have tested it don't. So he's quite critical. In fact, this is on top of a previous one here, which is the Gripen E is the least capable fighter, says Thomas Tyner, produced in Europe. Both Rafale and Eurofighter are much more capable than, those two are still less capable than the F-35A. Even the F-15EX is more capable than the Gripen E. No air force with access to either the F-35A, Rafale or Eurofighter will buy the Gripen E. It's just not happening. The Gripen E carries the least amount of weapons over the shortest distance, and stop with the Gripen E is improved for Arctic conditions. Where do you think Eilson Air Base is? So what you said before. Besides, at 10,000 meters, 33,000 feet, the temperature is minus 50 degrees Celsius, much colder than the Arctic conditions, and the Gripen E can take off from roads, only needs a short one-way arguments, roads, so can the F-35A, so can the Eurofighter, etc. And if a very short runway is your main concern, nothing can compete with the shortness of F-35B runways, i.e. Aircraft carriers. Sure, you can sacrifice fuel and weapons load if you operate F-35B instead of F-35A, but even the F-35B carries more fuel and weapons than a Gripen E, because the advertised Gripen E weapons load requires to cut back on 2/3 of the internal fuel, and the advertised Gripen E combat range requires external fuel tanks. The Gripen E is a good fighter, surely better than anything the Russians have, but it is a lightweight fighter which just can't compete with the West's best fighters, the F-35A, Eurofighter, Rafale and F-15EX. Its main competitor is actually the F-16, but the newest F-16 version, the F-16 Block 7072, is a better fighter than the Gripen E. Of all the mentioned fighters, the F-35A is the cheapest. Big production run equals lower cost. And unlike the Gripen E, the third generation of the Gripen and Gripen A, B and Gripen CD, the F-35 will evolve. New variants and weapons will be added over the next 40 plus years. The F-35 has also by far the best radar and avionics, and that's a reason why. Let's have a look. Australia, Germany, Canada, Czechia, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Greece, Israel, is that Ireland? No, Italy, sorry. Japan, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Romania, Turkey, South Korea, Switzerland, and Great Britain, UK have chosen the F-35. Only Brazil has chosen a Gripen E, which in the defence black holes South America are, and will be for decades, the most advanced fighters. So for Brazil, the Gripen E makes sense. Also for, i.e. Ireland, as they just need to patrol their airspace. But for everyone else in Europe, the F-35A is a better choice, followed by the Eurofighter or the Rafale. If you can't get those three, buy F-16 Block 70, as Hungary and Slovakia did. So there you go. There is a lot of counterpoints there to the Gripen, although it is thought that Ukraine definitely are in conversation with the Swedes about the Gripen. I personally think there's more chance that they get the Gripen than, say, the F-35 and the Eurofighter and the Rafale, because there probably aren't enough of them, but there aren't really that many Gripens either. But it depends, who can manufacture them and whether you can get the logistics and trained pilots sorted. It would be nice to have more F-16s as well, really. Let's face it. Okay. Ukrainian President Zelensky has offered perks for 18 to 25-year-olds joining the army, $24,000 a year, free university admission, no exams, zero interest mortgage, and 1-year contract. So they're trying to forcibly mobilize 18 to 25-year-olds, but attract them involuntarily. In February, Poland will launch a third recruitment for the Ukrainian Legion, Ambassador Vasyl Bodnar has announced. The first group is already in Ukraine, while the second is training in Poland. Numbers remain undisclosed by the Defence Ministry. It's good news that they are still doing that and that they've had two cohorts already. Now, the Yonhap news agency, moving on to Russian stuff now, that's the South Korean media agency, citing data from South Korea's Ministry of Defence, has reported that North Korea has sent around 200 long-range artillery units to Russia and is likely to send even more troops and weapons in support of Moscow's war against Ukraine. That's a real problem. I think you dismiss the North Koreans at your peril. They are a massive challenge for Ukraine. And if they get continued assistance, which apparently they are going to get more troops and more weapons, as mentioned there, then that's a real problem for Ukraine to overcome. Now, San Bendit says Russian military is testing the Soloist unmanned jet platform in Ukraine, as the state media describes it, a short-range hybrid of a drone and a guided munition with a jet engine. So rather like maybe the Peklo missile drone that the Ukrainians are now manufacturing, to go on low-flying and ground-based targets, to go after low-flying and ground-based targets. From Izvestia state media, Soloist is not a drone, but a guided munition. Once aimed, it is not controlled like a drone, but is adjusted along its trajectory. At the same time, it has a high speed, and even if it gets into the enemy's electronic warfare zone, can quickly overcome it, continuing to move along its trajectory even if control is lost. In tactical terms, the system will complement mortars and anti-tank missile systems, when the work of the ATGM anti-tank guided missile is complicated by the terrain, since it requires direct visibility, or when, in the case of a mortar, we cannot correct it. Soloist, with an installed course camera, allows for flight correction during the drone's free fall. So that could be rather challenging for the Ukrainians, but it depends how true the Russians are being with what they're claiming there. And moving on. Anton Gerashenko says Russia is secretly trying to purchase Swiss machine tools for high-precision weapons, according to the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. The Swiss Federal Intelligence Service has observed that Russia is trying to acquire sanctioned goods through covert structures and private companies in third countries. That is definitely a worry, as is this. So a Russian firm obtains NATO-sourced electronic warfare equipment, according to Defense Blog. They state that a Russian company within the state-owned Rostec Corporation has signed contracts worth 720 million rubles, approximately $7.5 million, to acquire American and German equipment to expand electronic warfare production, according to reports from Militiani. The Kaluga Research Radio Engineering Institute, a developer of electronic warfare systems for Sukhoi combat aircraft, finalized the contracts in December 2024. The deals involved the purchase of equipment from German technology firm Roeder and Schwarz and American company Keysight, despite ongoing Western sanctions, so on and so forth. It is, as the deliveries continue, the procurement of this equipment raises concerns over sanction evasion mechanisms and the effectiveness of international controls aimed at limiting Russia's access to high-tech defense components. I think this is an ongoing issue, needs to be sorted out, and it requires, unfortunately, the US to be really robust in their enforcing of the sanctions. And I don't know whether the Trump administration is in that zone at the moment. Now, interesting, not to do with the war necessarily, but my goodness, and this doesn't surprise me, Russian criminal organizations have begun using FPV drones to kill their business rivals, with the first recorded instance of such a thing taking place. So crime in the sky. A new page in the history of Russian crime. For the first time, the criminals have used FPV attack drone. As it's become known, at the beginning of this year, an attempt was made on the life of a large farmer in one of the Trans-Baikal regions. The businessman died on the spot from his injuries. The murder weapon was an FPV drone with explosives. So there you go. This is the world we are living in. Right, a couple of comments that I thought I'd go through. One here from Chris Staub. Thank you very much, my good man. Sorry I missed yesterday's military aid video and the discussion about Europe's level of defence spending, as I have commented on this before. I largely agree with JP on this issue, but for slightly different reasons. I've argued that after World War II, the US, so this is my idea that it is, we throw blame around that the US spends much more on defence than Europe, but my point has been that that's because it's part of their industrial and economic strategy. And in fact, they have place themselves in Europe and are spending the money and are providing defence for Europe for their own strategic interests, which means that the Europe doesn't have to. And Europe goes, well, if you're doing all that, then we can spend a bunch of this money on hospitals and education in a way that maybe you guys don't. And while it's easy to throw blame around, you could kind of switch that and say, well, actually, the US hasn't done a very good job on its own, maybe education system or healthcare systems, universal healthcare systems, and so on and so forth. And you guys should be doing a better job of doing that rather than spending so much on defense or so on and so forth. But, you know, rather than blame, it's just like, let's explain what's happened. And it's understandable that Europe is in that position because the US has positioned itself thusly. Now, it seems problematic to me that the new administration will come in and say, well, you guys haven't spent as much. Yeah, we haven't spent as much because you've been forcing yourself on Europe and you've got all these bases all over the place and you're doing that heavy lifting because you wanted to do that and it was in your strategic interest to do so. Like, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You're not providing that for Europe out of charity. So the reason why we're spending less is because you're spending more and you've impressed yourself on Europe. So you can't blame us now for not spending as much when that's been kind of your thing. And the Cold War was kind of your thing and NATO was kind of your thing. Like it's a game of, what's that board game, Twilight thingy about, you know, where it's it's a Cold War board game where you try and get control over different countries throughout the world. And you have these, you gain influence in these different countries. So the US and Russia's doing that. And Europe was, you know, one of the big battlefields of the Cold War, if you like. And so I really don't like this kind of blame culture of saying, you can argue that the UK right now needs to have spent more on defence. We spend an awful lot on defence, but actually, you know, we do it. We're one of the biggest spenders in the world on defence, but it turns out that's because we moved nuclear from the Foreign Office to nuclear deterrent to the MOD, and that like massively put up our defence expenditure. But actually, you know, when a lot of it's on pensions and nukes, it doesn't leave enough really for spending elsewhere. But anyway, I digress. Yes, we need to spend more, especially now. Times have changed, variables have changed, and now we are reacting to that. Anyway, I largely agree with JP on this issue, but for slightly different reasons. I've argued, he says, that after World War II, the US and Europe have had more or less implicit agreement that the US would spend more on defence, while Europe would focus largely on social services. This is really important because you've got to understand the post-war context. This was due to several factors, several of which Jonathan already mentioned, but I would also like to add the following. Because of the level of physical devastation in Europe, which wasn't the case in America, and the mostly political threat of communism after the end of World War II, Europe had to focus more on infrastructure and social services in order to avoid the possibility of communist uprisings taking place among their own populations. By contrast, the infrastructure in the US was virtually undamaged. Second, until the New Deal, there was no tradition of government spending on social services. Finally, the threat of the internal communist takeover, despite the Red Scare of the early 50s, was virtually nil. Instead of being internal, the threat of communism in America was mostly external, justifying a large military budget to counter the mostly military threat of global communism, so the bases in Europe. Because of this, while America and Europe had many historical, social and cultural traditions in common, each faced somewhat different needs and threats. Therefore, it made sense for a kind of division of labour to take place. America would continue to be the arsenal of democracy, while Europe would focus more on internal and domestic issues. But now we are seeing the backlash as the American worker falls further and further behind. Resentment has grown against both our own system of government, which has failed, so that's American system of government, which has failed to provide even the most basic level of social services, combined with the resentment that Europe has not been spending enough on their own defence. I think this explains some of the anger expressed in the comment writer at the beginning of the video. So this was James Haas. This resentment and jealousy has always been there, but as the average American worker has fallen further behind, the rise of Trump and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought these resentments to the surface. Really interesting comment. Thank you for that. And I love reading thoughtful comments that make me realise certain things and whatnot. So really good. Also, talking about sort of NATO funding and defence expenditure, etc., etc. Viggo Holmsson has said, interesting to note that all countries in NATO basically cut their military spending in half in the years immediately following the Cold War, including the USA. Some have kept their military spending relatively high due to strategic spheres of interest or immediate threats or conflicts. So, for example, he goes on to say, actually, among them are Turkey and Greece with their mutual conflict, and Turkey also has broader strategic interests due to their proximity to neighbouring conflict zones. Then there's the USA, the only country to really have global interests and ambitions beyond their own borders. And this is really important to note, that the reason the US spends so much on defence is because they're throwing themselves all around the world. All the bases they have around the world, compare those, how many bases does, I don't know, Spain have around the world, military bases around the world? How many, the UK, I mean, we used to live in Hong Kong, right? That no longer exists as a UK naval base. One of my sisters was born in Mauritius because we had a base in Mauritius. That's no longer the case. We still have the Falklands, we still have Gibraltar, but they're much smaller bases than they used to be. But compared to the US is projecting itself around the world, and that they spend a lot more in order to do that, so they can reap the rewards from that power projection. But yeah, then there's the USA, the only country to really have global interests and ambitions beyond their own borders. One may, to some extent, include the UK and France in this category due to their overseas territories and legacy regional involvements. It's a really good point. I was going to mention France because actually the French previous empire, French Polynesia and all the places in Africa and etc. etc. France and the UK have a slightly different situation in terms of military bases, but again, as mentioned, UK's really receded globally in that respect. The USA has also been constantly involved in one military conflict or another ever since the Cold War ended, but never on their own soil, contrary to the other nations who only joined with the US in their operations when there was a political need for them to do so. Many European countries are now remilitarizing due to changes in the strategic threat matrix, and that's the point. It's like change to the variables, you adapt. So okay, we now need to spend more on the military. So it's really easy with 2020 hindsight vision to go, oh, we haven't spent enough, god, we're so crap. No, we didn't spend enough because we didn't need to at that time, and actually we spent on other things that you are now happy that money was spent on education and healthcare. So we have a functioning healthcare system because we plugged loads of more money into that than the military or whatever. And now, of course, we need, in the UK, money in education, healthcare, and the military. But you get my point. So anyway, Vigo finishes, and we have to change back from a limited external operations capability, adopter largely due to a suggestion by the USA, to an all-encompassing national defense mode and a more extensive regional responsibility. So the US pulls back or claims that we need to spend more. Okay, well then you can pull back, go away, we'll do all this, but that means we all need to spend way more on defense and less on these other things because there are limited resources and we need to be fighting over what each dollar or each euro is being spent on. And of course that then becomes a bit of a domestic issue because you've got to sell that to your electorate. The electorate will need to understand that if the US recedes from global power projection, then the EU or Europe or the UK or Norway will need to step up, and that means that you will not have governments promising to spend all sorts of money on social welfare, and there will need to be more pennies spent on defence, and that's a hard sell for your electorate, and you will struggle to get into power easily on the back of that. Foreign. This is why US aid is an easy one to cut. It's because it's much more difficult to express the importance of, say, US aid to the American electorate, because you're talking about big global games of 4D chess rather than domestic issues. So foreign policy is a much harder sell, electorally speaking, when you've got elections coming up than domestic issues. And that is a challenge. Anyway, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was of interest and informative. Just to let you know, in the description to the video below, there should be details for a campaign that Rick the Ukrainian is running. We are supporting his campaign at the moment until we get a joint NAFO campaign up and running in a few weeks' time between Rick the Ukrainian and ATP Geopolitics. But in the meantime, at least if you have any spare cash at all, then there are some links in the description below to help the Ukrainians' present campaign. So check it out below. Anyway, thanks again. Take care. Speak soon.